In the mid-30s, two young men from the city of Cleveland began to imagine the adventures of a super powerful character capable of performing impressive feats of strength and heroism. This character, who would be called Superman, would eventually inspire the creation of many other superheroes from different companies, and over time, his influence would be so great that it would reach other countries through figures like All Might, who represents the most classic ideals of the Man of Steel but seen from the Japanese point of view. However, transitioning from Superman to characters like All Might or Saitama was challenging, especially if we consider that at one point in history, superheroes were a completely American cultural expression that took pride in their country's atomic power. So while Japan was creating cultural expressions like Godzilla, Evangelion, or Barefoot Gen, that is, stories that talk about the danger of technology, war, and nuclear bombs, the United States was building these atomic power fantasies, characters who used the gifts that radiation gave them to fight against evil, true children of the atom. That's why watching My Hero Academia was so interesting, which we'll discuss in this video.
About how this story takes the most essential elements of American superheroes and presents them under a completely fresh perspective, surprisingly offering us a narrative that feels like a manga and a comic at the same time, a true cultural fusion of the superhero concept, through which they touch on incredibly deep themes like the freedom to be, and above all, the true meaning of what it is to be a hero and its limitations. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today, as many had asked me, we are going to take My Hero Academia very, very seriously. I, Go, the Geek Monitor.
A couple of important facts. Here in this video, I'm only going to base myself on what happens in the anime and not in the manga. So if you're only watching the anime, don't worry about spoilers. I'll only share a big spoiler from Season 3. For the rest of the seasons, I'll only mention general details of the story without talking much about specific circumstances. Finally, as this is a different video than usual, I'll tell you that I'm more into American comics. That's why I'll discuss the parallels and differences between My Hero Academia and these other comics. So to get the full cultural picture, I interviewed Kei from the TikTok profile Made in Japan by Kei, who makes videos about the cultural differences between Japan and Mexico. With this in mind, let's start with the analysis. Chapter 1. Superheroes according to Japan. The central premise of My Hero Academia is that the entire story unfolds in a world where 80% of the global population is born with a special power or ability commonly referred to as a gift or quirk. This is similar to what we've seen in stories like X-Men, with the difference that in this world these people are for the most part well received and socially accepted. But this is just the beginning of the similarities and differences. For example, power levels in My Hero Academia work differently than what we see in American superheroes. Why do I say this? Because in this anime, someone's power level basically depends on two things. First is the gift with which each person is born. From a young age, everyone told Bakugo that he was born with a very powerful gift. This is similar to what we see in American comics. Some abilities are more powerful than others, but there's a key difference. In My Hero Academia, we are told a lot that the power level also has to do with the effort and the level of training each character has had. For example, Lemillion had a power that was considered weak, but he managed to be the #1 student at UA thanks to his effort. This approach is not as common in American comics. For example, Batman has his abilities thanks to his training, which he continues to do. But it's not like we see him improve as the comic numbering progresses, because often it's not even the same person writing the stories, or sometimes they're not even in the same universe. He and other characters maintain a consistent epic level throughout the comics, which may fluctuate based on the writer and circumstance. On the other hand, mangas and anime, being more linear stories, do present us with a gradual progress where characters usually improve through training or transformations. My Hero Academia blends two distinct narrative types to provide a Japanese perspective on the superhero archetype. What is the reason behind this approach? It's related to cultural differences, as fictional stories reflect the culture that creates them. In this case, the difference likely stems from how the Japanese perceive effort and work.
Hardworking, are they? Check this out.
According to recent surveys, most Japanese employees work an average of 2.6 to 3 unpaid overtime hours daily, and most do not take their full vacations because they feel guilty. This culture of constant and intense work has several causes, but it can be traced back to the Meiji Restoration era in 1868, where Japan's feudal society wanted to reach the same economic level as Western countries. And this gives us a better idea of why Japanese stories have so much to do with effort and work. Another very big difference in how this story sees superheroes. It has to do with the regulation of powers. In anime such as My Hero Academia or One Punch Man, the government heavily regulates the superhero profession. That is, not just anyone with powers can be a superhero. Due to the requirement of trial exams, schooling, training, and licensing, so that each character can become one. And this is very different from what happens in American comics. In the comic Civil War, two groups of superheroes fought each other, with one side opposing registration, training, and government intervention. This is a recurring theme in such comics. It's as if the figure of the American superhero was historically this free spirit, without regulation, who only answers to his actions, and to his morality. In Japan it's different. But it also has to do with culture, with
This in mind we can understand to do everything. I know it in Mexico and Latin America. Anyone can cut hair without a license. In Japan, a license is required to cut someone's hair.
With this in mind, we can understand why for the Japanese, it is so natural that a profession, especially one as important as being a superhero, is so regulated, unlike what we see in DC and Marvel characters. This distinction becomes even more interesting. While Civil War questions the government's role in regulating superheroes, in My Hero Academia, villains like the Paranormal Liberation Front advocate for unrestricted use of powers without government oversight, which is portrayed negatively. This shows that despite being superhero stories, each cultural product has a distinct focus. Similarly, in My Hero Academia, the police and government forces are presented as quite competent. UA is always aware of the government's statements. The superheroes work very closely with the investigation agencies to plan their attacks, and we even see the police take a very active role in the raids despite not having powers. This is also different from what we see in Western superhero stories, where the regular police don't have as much prominence, and instead the superheroes rely on more specialized organizations like Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, or Argos, which made me wonder, how is the police viewed in Japan? I'm posting lots of original content on Instagram that I don't share here, including videos about Sandman and Baby Reindeer, as well as infographics about Inside Out and types of Boy Scout leaders. We are really putting a lot of effort into the original content on Instagram, so it would help me a lot if you follow me there after finishing the video. Perhaps that's why in Mexican fiction, the police tend to have such flexible morals. Finally, something that caught my attention a lot is that superheroes have very marked ranks. This is something I saw both in My Hero Academia and in One Punch Man. That in these worlds, they openly know who is the number 1 hero, the number 2, the number 3, etc. This not only applies to professional superheroes, but even within UA, there is a group of heroes who are literally called the Big Three. On the other hand, in American comics, we all know that Superman is the number 1 hero, but it's not like they go around saying it openly. Let's say that Superman is more modest. And speaking of Superman, my favorite character from My Hero Academia is undoubtedly All Might, a character who represents many essential characteristics of the Man of Steel, but presents them in such a way that tells us a completely different story. Chapter 2. The Symbolic Power of All Might. Since he was a child, Izuku Midoriya always wanted to be a hero so he could save everyone with a smile on his face, just like All Might, his favorite hero. Unfortunately, he was a boy who was born without any special abilities in a world where 80% of the population has powers, which meant he was not a candidate for such a job. This changed when Izuku ran to save the life of his schoolmate Kachan and gave All Might time to save them both. After this, All Might himself tells Deku that he can be a hero and begins to train him to later inherit his power, the legendary One for All, with which Izuku must become the greatest hero of all. The story's central premise, highlighting the significant differences between Superman and All Might despite their similarities, is highly appealing. From the start, All Might is shown as a hero with the most classic Superman-like qualities. He is a super strong character who always does good, saves everyone, and is considered the top hero in his universe. When he appears on the scene, we can hear a very Superman-like melody, and he even has these closed eyes that the Man of Steel had in his most classic versions. But the story is not centered on him but on his successor and his eating habits, who inherits his powers as All Might is gradually losing his strength. So it's the story of Superman's successor. That's something different because I don't recall seeing a premise like this in DC Comics. Yes, there are stories where characters like John Kent take up the mantle temporarily, but we all know there's a point where Kal-El will return to being Superman. This is not the case here. This is the story of Toshinori Yagi's final days as the greatest hero of all and how his successor is forced to face the threats that not even All Might himself could eradicate. This would be difficult to achieve in DC. Because Superman is a huge hero whose entire story we know, but in My Hero Academia they use the symbolic power that Superman has, they project it onto All Might through various characteristics, and in this way they manage to make the character feel familiar while we feel open to hearing the story of his successor. In the first few episodes it feels like you already know All Might despite being told very little about him. And rather, they introduce you to fragments of his past little by little while they tell you the story of Deku's future. But this symbolic power of Superman that they project onto All Might not only works to make us open to hearing Deku's story, but it also gives All Might his own distinctive personality. Because yes, publicly All Might is this super powerful and infallible character who always has a smile, but secretly he is this weak and sickly character named Toshinori who at the beginning of the story can only maintain his muscular appearance for a few hours a day. Toshinori, unlike All Might, does worry and does get sad. Toshinori represents the real and All Might represents the ideal. It's as if All Might is a kind of performance, a mask that Toshinori uses. First of all, to hide the fear that he himself has when facing villains. But more than anything, to convey a sense of calm to the public. Through All Might, the series tells us that symbols are very important, and that's why other very powerful heroes like Endeavor are unable to represent what All Might represents because his power goes beyond super strength. Just like Superman, his greatest ability is to inspire and to be good. This also weighs on Toshinori, who feels that he has to hide his weak appearance so as not to lose people's trust. However, when the public learns the truth behind All Might's battle against All for One, Toshinori realizes that his symbolic power is so great that it now transcends appearance itself because his legacy and actions speak louder than his physique. Perhaps that's why even though we see him get hurt in this battle with loose clothing and a thin, sickly body, we see him have his most iconic and inspiring moment of the entire series.
Now,
it's your turn. And all of this makes All Might a huge character. One that is so big that even though we are getting to know Deku's story, it continues to be an extremely important part of the whole plot. Not because he actively participates in all situations, but because his mere existence advances the plot. All Might inspired not only Deku, but also characters like Bakugo, Star and Stripe to become heroes. Even Endeavor's motivations are closely tied to All Might's existence. And this goes beyond the heroes. Stain, known as the Hero Killer, judges professional heroes' capabilities based on his belief in All Might's standard. And this character in turn indirectly played a very important role in the creation of the League of Villains, which tells us that the existence of a character as big as All Might has positive and negative consequences. I found all of this very intriguing, but what captivated me most about this character was the concept of One for All and its counterpart, All for One. One for All is a gift passed down through generations of heroes, accumulating and amplifying the power and abilities of each predecessor. Beyond this, One for All appears to serve as a declaration of heroism. Each bearer uses their abilities for the benefit of others, they give themselves for others. In this way, One for All is the manifestation of the altruism that we think a hero should represent. Conversely, the villain All for One possesses the ability to steal others' gifts. He is unbridled selfishness incarnate, a person who takes everything for himself. Another very interesting point is that unlike what we regularly see in American comics, it is the existence of the villain that makes the hero emerge. All for One is the cause and One for All is the consequence. All for One is the thesis and One for All is the antithesis that forms as a result of the evil actions that were being committed. In this way, the story tells us that heroism arises as a result of injustice and that the individualism of All for One can be combated through the collectivity of several people working to procure the common good, because that is the essence of One for All. Watching My Hero Academia then is to take a look at the most classic side of American superheroes with all their cliches, but seen through the Japanese cultural lens, which for some reason manages to revitalize and finds a different meaning to these cliches that we sometimes think are already obsolete. It's a story where there are completely good and compassionate characters who manage to save everyone, but at the same time the story uses these cliches to ask quite interesting questions about what heroism really is in a modern context and even the negative consequences it can have. It's as if you're seeing familiar figures, situations and characters but in a completely different context. As a superhero fan, I was delighted to read this story. I wonder what these two young men from Cleveland would have thought, knowing how far this concept of a super powerful person who is fully intent on promoting the welfare of others has come. If you want to follow Kei and learn more about Japanese culture, I'll leave his social networks in the description. And if you're interested in having more of my content completely free, remember to follow me on Instagram because you really support me a lot. That's all for today. I'm going plus ultra. I mean, keep looking beyond the obvious.